Grant Holloway broke the law the moment he hid a bleeding stranger under his workshop floor. 3 armed men were hunting her through the rain, and one of them wore the same badge Grant had trusted for 16 years. He thought he was saving a nurse. He was wrong. The woman bleeding on his floor was carrying evidence that could destroy half the county, and the men chasing her weren't criminals at all. By morning, Grant would learn her real name, her real mission, and the one name on her list he never wanted to see: the man who raised him back up after his wife died. The rain had been falling over Bellwether, Missouri for 6 straight hours by the time Grant locked the front bay of his repair shop and started toward the back office to shut off the lights. He heard something strike the metal trash bin behind the building, a hollow clang, followed by a scrape, and his first thought was a raccoon or a stray dog looking for shelter from the storm. When he pushed open the rear door, he found a woman in a nurse's uniform slumped against the brick wall, her sleeve dark with blood that the rain kept washing thin. She told him her name was Mallory Vance, that she worked at Bellwether Medical Center, and that she had just watched 2 men kill a co-worker in the hospital parking lot. Grant reached for his phone to call the sheriff without thinking twice, because in a town this size, the sheriff was the only number that mattered, and Silas Crow had been the closest thing to family Grant had left since his wife died. Mallory grabbed his wrist with a strength that surprised him for someone losing so much blood, and she begged him not to make that call, insisting the men chasing her were listening to police frequencies and would find her the instant he dialed. Headlights swept across the gravel lot before Grant could argue 3 dark sport utility vehicles rolling in slow and deliberate the kind of arrival that had nothing to do with an emergency response. Grant looked at the fear on Mallory's face and recognized something he hadn't seen in 16 years, not since the night strangers drove past his wife lying on the shoulder of a county road, and not one of them stopped. He made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an old promise, finally being kept pulling Mallory through the shop and down into a service pit he had once used to inspect undercarriages before he installed a modern lift. He wrapped her shoulder with clean rags and antiseptic from his first aid kit, and as he worked, he noticed the wound didn't look like a cut from broken glass the way she claimed, but like a graze from a bullet that had come far too close. Mallory kept insisting it was glass, and Grant let the lie sit between them without challenging it out loud, though he asked her plainly whether she had told him a single true thing since she arrived. She didn't answer, because at that moment, fists began pounding on the front door of the shop. Grant hadn't planned to become the kind of man who hid strangers from armed men in the middle of the night, but standing in that narrow pit with a bleeding woman gripping his sleeve, he found himself thinking less about the danger and more about the years he had spent building a life around the quiet routines precisely, so nothing this unpredictable could ever touch him again. He had raised a daughter alone in this town, had learned to keep his head down, pay his bills, and let Bellwether's small dramas pass him by without comment. And yet here he was, seconds from a decision that could unravel everything he had carefully protected. Mallory's eyes never stopped moving toward the stairwell, even as he worked on her shoulder counting exits, the way a frightened animal counts them, and something about that instinct told Grant this woman had survived far worse nights than this one before tonight ever began. The man leading the group introduced himself as Deputy Nolan Briggs, flashing a photo of Mallory on his phone and claiming she was a hospital employee suspected of stealing controlled substances and possibly armed. Grant opened the door only wide enough to block the entrance with his own body, and from the pit below, Mallory heard every word through the floor vents, quietly working a small memory card free from a pendant around her neck and hiding it in a gap behind the wall studs before anyone could search her. Grant told Nolan he hadn't seen any woman that night, and when Nolan pointed to a smear of blood near the dumpster, Grant calmly explained he had just finished stitching up a stray dog before letting it wander off into the storm. One of the deputies wanted to search the building anyway, but Grant asked for a warrant, and Nolan's friendly tone thinned into something colder as he mentioned that the shop's fire permits were due for renewal and that a surprise inspection could shut the place down for weeks. Grant understood then that Nolan wasn't only hunting for Mallory, he was trying to frighten a mechanic into stepping aside without a fight, and Grant simply asked why a suspect accused of theft required 3 vehicles and armed men in the middle of the night. Nolan's composure cracked for a half-second before he ordered his men back into their vehicles, though not before secretly attaching a small tracking device beneath Grant's pickup truck on his way out. Standing at the doorway, Grant kept his weight braced against the frame, the entire conversation aware that a single step backward would read as invitation, and a single step forward would read as a threat he couldn't afford to make against 3 armed men. He recognized 2 of Nolan's deputies from around town, faces he'd nodded to at the diner or the gas station 100 times, without ever once suspecting they might show up on his property looking for someone to disappear. That familiarity unsettled him more than any stranger could have, because it meant whatever was happening in Bellwether wasn't confined to a handful of corrupt men hiding in the shadows. It had roots wide enough to reach ordinary faces he passed every single day. When Nolan finally turned to leave, he paused at the edge of the gravel lot and told Grant that men who mind their own business tend to live longer in this county. A line delivered with the same easy smile he might use to comment on the weather. Grant waited until the taillights disappeared down the highway before he opened the service pit again, and by then Mallory was pale and unsteady from blood loss, her breathing shallow against the cold concrete. He demanded the truth this time, and Mallory admitted only that the men hunting her were connected to the medical center and to certain people inside the sheriff's own office. Still unwilling to reveal who she really was, because she had no way of knowing whether Grant's loyalty belonged to Silas Crow. Grant noticed calluses along her fingers that didn't match a nurse's hands, the way she instinctively checked windows and mirrors, the way she had positioned herself near the exit the entire time. They talked, none of it fitting the story she kept repeating. When he asked why she had run specifically to his shop, she claimed it was simply the nearest building. But Grant looked at the map pinned above his workbench and counted at least 3 closer locations between the hospital and where they stood. He realized she had chosen him on purpose, and before he could press her further, the power in the building cut out without warning, plunging the shop into darkness, broken only by the drumming rain outside. Footsteps returned almost immediately, careful and unhurried, confirming that Nolan's team had never actually left the property. Grant killed the backup generator so the men outside wouldn't hear it hum, then guided Mallory through a narrow corridor toward the parts storage room at the rear of the building. A route he knew by memory from years of working there, alone at odd hours. Mallory urged him to walk out the front door and pretend ignorance while she found her own way out, certain that Nolan wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who had already seen too much. But Grant refused to leave her reasoning that a man who cut the power and broke in without lights or sirens wasn't operating within any lawful authority. He heard glass shatter near the loading dock as Nolan and 2 men entered, without announcing themselves, and Grant used the shop's compressed air system to create a diversion, triggering a pneumatic tool at the far end of the building and sending a rack of tires clattering down a walkway to draw them away. Mallory watched him move through his own workshop with the calm precision of someone who had spent years pulling people out of wrecked cars. And when she asked how he stayed so steady, Grant told her that panic only got people killed faster. In situations like this, one of Nolan's men found Mallory near the back hallway, and she disarmed him with a joint lock and a takedown that had nothing to do with hospital training, a sequence of moves too clean and too practiced for anyone but a professional. Grant helped her pin the man down, but stopped her from taking his firearm, refusing to let the shop become the site of a shootout, and instead he took the deputy's phone and identification badge while the man lay stunned on the concrete floor. A message lit up the screen before it locked again, a short line reading that they needed to recover the evidence, and that Crow wanted the woman alive if it could be managed. Grant stared at the sheriff's name glowing on a stranger's phone and felt something shift inside his chest. A suspicion he wasn't ready to accept, forming faster than he could push it away. Mallory admitted then that Silas Crow was one of the men she had been investigating, though she still didn't know whether he was the one running the operation or simply another person being used by it. Grant accused her of manipulating him, of turning an old friendship into a weapon, but Mallory asked him plainly whether an innocent man would order deputies to break into a private business, cut the electricity, and hunt down a witness in the dark, and Grant had no answer for that. As Nolan pushed deeper into the shop, Grant and Mallory hid inside an old ambulance parked in the bay for repairs, and there she discovered hidden compartments welded beneath the floor panels of the vehicle. Grant explained the ambulance belonged to Wade Sutter's private medical transport company, and that Wade had specifically ordered him never to inspect the rear storage area while working on the suspension system. Prying one compartment open, Grant found sealed bags of prescription medication, stamped with hospital labels, alongside dozens of counterfeit patient identification bracelets, the first physical proof of the operation sitting inside his own garage. Nolan's voice called out through the darkness, claiming Silas was on his way and promising forgiveness if Grant simply handed the woman over before things escalated any further. Grant looked at the injured stranger beside him and then at the stolen medication in his hands. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder whether the man who had stood beside him at his wife's funeral was someone else entirely underneath the badge. He thought about all the times Wade Sutter had dropped off an ambulance for minor repairs and stood a little too close while Grant worked, watching his hands rather than the engine, and how at the time Grant had simply assumed the man was particular about his fleet. Now those memories rearranged themselves into something far more deliberate, a pattern of quiet surveillance, disguised as routine maintenance requests, each visit a chance to make certain Grant never looked too closely at what those vehicles actually carried. Mallory crouched beside him, examining the labels on the medication bags with the practiced eye of someone who had spent months memorizing exactly this kind of packaging. And she confirmed what Grant already suspected, that the batch numbers matched shipments reported stolen from 3 separate hospitals over the past year. They escaped through an old drainage tunnel behind the storage room and reached Grant's pickup truck parked on the far side of the property. And along the way, Grant found the tracking device Nolan had planted quickly, transferring it to a passing lumber truck heading in the opposite direction to buy them time. He drove to an abandoned hunting cabin on land he still owned outside town. And once inside, he told Mallory plainly that he would not risk his life for her again unless she gave him the entire truth. She pulled a waterproof wallet from a hidden pocket sewn into her jacket lining, revealing a badge from the Missouri Special Investigations Unit, and confessed that she was an undercover detective, not a nurse at all. 8 months earlier, the state had noticed a significant amount of prescription pain medication vanishing from small regional hospitals, with records showing the drugs dispensed to patients who either didn't exist or had already died. Every previous inquiry into Bellwether had been quietly shut down for lack of evidence, and 2 earlier investigators had suffered accidents that never quite added up. Mallory had taken the nurse's identity to work inside the medical center, where she discovered that Tessa Monroe had been pressured into signing falsified records, that Wade Sutter's ambulance fleet moved the stolen medication, that Nolan Briggs personally handled anyone who threatened to expose the arrangement. That very night, she had copied a hidden ledger, listing the names of everyone receiving payment from the operation, only to be discovered before she could transmit the data to her superiors. Grant asked why she hadn't simply contacted state police for backup, and Mallory admitted the entire operation had been compromised from the inside, that someone on her own team was likely feeding information straight to Silas, leaving her with no one left to trust. She then admitted the real reason she had run to his shop that night, explaining that 3 weeks earlier, she had watched Grant refuse payment from an elderly veteran for a repair job, and that her background check on him had turned up a fire rescue years before, in which he'd pulled 3 strangers from a burning factory without ever accepting a reward. She needed someone outside Silas's network, someone with medical skill and enough nerve not to hand her over, and she had chosen Grant deliberately without asking his permission first. Grant was furious to learn he had been studied and selected like a tool for her mission, accusing her of using his own decency against him without ever giving him a choice in the matter. Mallory didn't deny it, but she pointed out that she could never have predicted a stranger would stand against an entire team of armed deputies to protect someone he had just met an hour earlier. She showed him the list of names tied to the stolen ledger, and Silas Crow's name sat at the very top of the page. The second name on the list staggered Grant far more than the first, because it read Helen Holloway, his wife, who had been dead for 16 years. Grant insisted the list had to be a fabrication since Helen had worked as an accountant at the medical center and had never been anything but honest in her life. Mallory clarified that Helen's name wasn't listed among those receiving payment, but under a separate heading marked as risks requiring elimination. The cabin fell into a silence so complete that Grant could hear the rain still ticking against the tin roof, each drop landing like a small hammer against the years of grief he thought he had finally put behind him. He had spent a decade and a half believing his wife's death was simply cruel chance, one of those senseless accidents that leave a family gutted for no reason anyone can ever explain, and he had built an entire life around accepting that senselessness because the alternative had been too heavy to carry. Now Mallory was telling him the accident had a name attached to it, a motive, a chain of decisions made by people who had calculated that one woman's silence was worth more than her life, and something in Grant's chest hardened in a resolve he hadn't felt in longer than he could. Remember, 16 years earlier, Helen had noticed the earliest irregularities in the hospital's medication records, back when the operation was still small and easy to hide, and she had copied several invoices with the intention of sending them to state authorities. Days later, she died in a car accident on a dry, empty stretch of county road, with no witnesses anywhere nearby. The officer who led that original investigation had been Silas Crow, the same man who arrived at the hospital first, who broke the news of her death to Grant with his own hands, and who quietly helped arrange the funeral for a young widower who had nowhere else to turn. Grant realized that the comfort Silas had offered him all those years might never have come from friendship at all, but from a need to stay close enough to learn exactly what Helen had told her husband before she died. Mallory found a note buried in old case files, suggesting a portion of Helen's evidence had never been recovered, and she believed Helen might have hidden a copy somewhere only Grant would think to look. Grant remembered a toolbox that had belonged to Helen, still sitting untouched in the house they once shared, a house he had never been able to bring himself to open since her death. The property now served as storage for the shop, and sat near the center of town, well within the reach of Silas's control, making any trip there dangerous in ways Mallory didn't want Grant to face. She urged him to leave Bellwether entirely, insisting he had already done more than enough and owed her nothing further. But Grant told her this had stopped being only her mission the moment Helen's name appeared on that list. They agreed to return to the house before sunrise, and while they prepared, Silas himself called Grant's phone, his voice calm and warm, as if the entire night had never happened. He apologized for Nolan's overreach, calling Mallory a dangerous suspect manipulating a grieving man, and he mentioned almost gently that he hoped Grant's daughter overseas wouldn't have to hear terrible news about her father. The comment was dressed as concern but landed as a threat, and Grant understood exactly what Silas was capable of saying without ever raising his voice. He pretended to believe every word, and agreed to meet Silas at the shop at dawn, buying himself the only thing he had left, a few precious hours before the trap could close around them. Grant told Mallory that when Silas discovered his threats hadn't worked, he would stop pretending to be patient, and she asked if he was truly certain he wanted to keep going. Grant answered that 16 years earlier Helen had stood alone because he never knew she was fighting for her life, and this time no one was going to stand alone again. They slipped into the old house through a rear cellar door, moving past photographs Grant had turned face down years ago because he couldn't bear to look at them. Helen's toolbox sat locked inside a small steel cabinet, and when they finally opened it, they found only a notebook, a pen, an old calculator, and a bookkeeping manual, nothing resembling proof of anything. Grant remembered Helen's habit of hiding important papers inside the bindings of books she thought no one else would touch, and he carefully split open the manual's spine to reveal a small safety deposit key taped alongside a slip of paper with a string of numbers written in her handwriting. The numbers pointed toward a deposit box at the local bank, one final piece of the puzzle Helen had left behind without ever knowing whether anyone would find it. The lights snapped on before they could process what they'd found, and Nolan stood waiting with 2 armed men already inside the house. He revealed that Silas had always suspected Helen left something behind, and that for years he'd kept quiet watch over Grant just in case she had. When Mallory ran to Grant's workshop that same night, Silas understood 2 long-standing threats had collided by accident under one roof. A brutal struggle broke out in the cramped house, and rather than fight head-on, Grant used pull cords, shelving, and an old generator to scatter Nolan's men through the narrow rooms. Mallory, though wounded, managed to subdue one attacker, and Grant seized his radio in time to hear Silas ordering that both of them be taken alive. Nolan cornered Grant in the kitchen and mocked him for spending 16 years grateful to the very man who had ordered his wife's death, and Grant nearly lost control before remembering Mallory needed him, thinking clearly, not enraged. He blinded Nolan with a fire extinguisher and shoved him into a storage closet, locking the door, before he and Mallory fled in a vehicle abandoned by one of the fallen deputies. Before leaving, Mallory took Nolan's phone and found a recent recording of a conversation between him and Silas, in which Silas ordered the recovery of the key, the destruction of the house, and a plan to stage Grant's death as a suicide brought on by grief. It was the first direct piece of evidence tying Silas to an active conspiracy to commit murder, but the memory card holding Mallory's stolen ledger still sat hidden inside a wall back at the shop. They now faced an impossible choice between retrieving Helen's evidence from the bank or Mallory's evidence from the shop, without enough time left to secure both before Silas locked down the entire town. Grant suggested splitting up, but Mallory refused, certain that was exactly the mistake Silas was hoping they would make. And instead, Grant proposed forcing Silas to move his entire team away from one location by convincing him the key was already in the hands of state police. Grant used Nolan's phone to send a false message claiming Mallory had already reached her superiors and planned to hand over the key at the old train station north of town, and Silas immediately redirected most of his men there. It was a gamble built on the assumption that a man like Silas, so accustomed to controlling every version of events, would rather chase a fabricated lead than sit still and wonder what he might be missing, and Grant found a strange satisfaction in using the sheriff's own paranoia as a weapon against him. With the town's attention diverted, Grant and Mallory slipped back toward the center of Bellwether, Mallory disguising herself in a jacket and cap taken from Nolan's vehicle, while Grant drove one of Wade Sutter's ambulances, loaded with counterfeit medication, straight through without drawing suspicion. Inside the bank, they opened Helen's deposit box and found copies of the falsified invoices, photographs of illicit deliveries, and an old cassette recording. On the tape, Helen described discovering that Silas and Wade were stealing medication, and that Silas had once offered to pay her for her silence before she refused him outright. Her final words on the recording asked Grant not to spend his entire life seeking revenge if anything happened to her, urging him instead to protect the truth without becoming a man like the one who had threatened her. As Mallory copied the files onto several devices, Tessa Monroe arrived, having finally received Mallory's earlier signal, but still visibly terrified of what she was about to do. Tessa confirmed at least 6 people had died after uncovering pieces of the operation, and that several death records had been quietly altered to hide the true causes. Grant convinced her that silence no longer protected her, that it only allowed Silas to choose his next victim without resistance. And Tessa agreed to grant them access to the hospital's internal servers. Before they could transmit the evidence through the bank's secure connection, the line went dead, and moments later, Silas himself appeared outside with Nolan, who had already broken free from the storage closet. Silas announced over a loudspeaker that Grant was holding 2 innocent women hostage inside the bank, twisting the entire situation for anyone listening on the street. Mallory understood that if Grant stepped outside, he risked being shot under the pretense of resisting arrest, and she realized the security cameras inside the bank were still recording locally despite the severed connection. They decided against fleeing again, choosing instead to force Silas inside to speak the truth on camera, and find another way to release the footage once it was captured. Grant announced through the bank's intercom that he would speak only to Silas directly, and Tessa stepped briefly into view at the glass doors to prove no one was being held against their will. To preserve his image as a reasonable negotiator, Silas had no choice but to enter the bank alone, leaving Mallory hidden behind a teller counter while Grant stood in the open lobby holding Helen's key. Grant asked flatly whether Silas had ordered Helen's death, and Silas avoided a direct answer, insisting instead that Helen had threatened hundreds of jobs, the police budget, and the entire town's future, and that exposing the operation back then would have collapsed the local economy. He claimed he had only sacrificed one life to save an entire community, a rationalization Grant found impossible to accept from a man who had once held him through the worst grief of his life. When Grant pressed him about everyone who had died since Helen, Silas answered that one large lie always requires countless smaller ones to keep it standing, and Grant understood that Silas felt no remorse at all, only regret that Helen's proof had taken this long to surface. Silas tried appealing to their old bond, reminding Grant of the years he had spent supporting him through hardship, sitting beside him at Helen's funeral, and helping keep his shop afloat through lean times. Grant told him plainly that none of it had ever come from friendship, that Silas had only stayed close to make certain Grant never learned the truth. He thought of every Sunday dinner, every fishing trip, every quiet word of encouragement Silas had offered over 16 years, and realized now that each one had likely been measured, calculated a performance sustained far longer than most men could manage, without ever slipping. Silas's expression shifted then, the warmth draining out of it the way it might drain from a man realizing a long con had finally run its course, and for a moment, Grant saw something almost like exhaustion in his face, the tiredness of a man who had carried a decades-long deception and could no longer remember which parts of himself had ever been real. He asked Grant if he honestly believed the town would thank him for burning it all down, for taking away the jobs, the funding, the fragile stability that the operation's money had quietly propped up for years. And Grant answered that a town built on someone else's blood was never stable to begin with, only patient. The moment Silas realized the exchange was being recorded, his composure vanished, and he drew a hidden pistol from behind his back, only for Mallory to step out and level her own weapon at him while announcing his arrest. Silas laughed, telling her that her authority meant nothing now, since even her own commanding officer had been on the payroll all along, and was the one who had leaked her operation from the start, finally explaining why every attempt to reach her superiors had failed. Outside, Nolan lost patience and ordered his men to breach the doors despite Silas's objections, revealing that he no longer intended to protect his old partner, only to erase every witness left standing and pin the blame on Grant. Silas realized in that instant that Nolan was betraying him just as thoroughly as he had once betrayed Helen, and an armored vehicle crashed through the bank's front entrance an instant later. In the chaos, Silas grabbed the device holding their evidence and fled toward the rear exit with Mallory close behind him, while Grant stayed just long enough to guide Tessa safely through the broken glass and out a fire door. Nolan and his armed team stormed inside, and Grant triggered the sprinkler system, pulled the fire alarm, and forced the emergency exits open to give Tessa a clear path outside. He could have kept running, but instead, he turned back because Mallory was now alone against both Silas and Nolan, with nothing but a half-charged weapon and a bleeding shoulder. The chase ended behind the hospital at Wade Sutter's ambulance lot, where Silas tried commandeering a vehicle to break through the perimeter, while Nolan demanded the evidence for himself, intending to eliminate Silas entirely once he had it. Old resentments boiled over between the two men, Nolan accusing Silas of going soft over his misplaced affection for Grant, and Silas dismissing Nolan as nothing more than a blunt instrument who never understood how real power was maintained. Mallory found herself trapped between rows of supply crates, her wound bleeding freely again, unable to face both men directly at once. Grant drove the ambulance loaded with counterfeit medication straight through the gate, forcing Nolan to dive clear as the vehicle slammed into a stack of crates and split the two men apart. He found Mallory pinned down, and when she urged him to take the evidence and run without her, Grant refused, telling her that none of this meant anything if the people trying to do right always ended up dying alone. They discovered a satellite uplink device inside Wade's command vehicle, a tool used to track illegal shipments without relying on cellular networks, and Mallory connected it to a laptop carrying the bank footage and Helen's recovered files, though the upload would take several critical minutes to complete. Grant needed to hold Nolan off during that window, so he triggered the sirens and lights on every parked ambulance at once. The sudden chaos of sound and light, making it impossible for anyone to pinpoint their exact position. Silas approached and offered a temporary truce, promising to surrender if Grant handed over the evidence and helped him stop Nolan first, and Grant pretended to agree, well aware the offer was another lie. When Nolan drew closer, Silas turned and shot him without warning, wounding but not killing him, and the two men who had run the operation together for years finally turned their weapons on each other. Grant had a clear opportunity to take Silas's gun and end things violently. But Helen's final words echoed in his mind, urging him to protect the truth rather than become a man defined by vengeance. And he used a hydraulic lift instead to pin Silas against a support beam and strip the weapon from his hands. The sirens Grant had triggered wailed on without pause, red and blue light strobing across the rain-slicked pavement in a rhythm that made the whole lot feel like it was breathing. And somewhere beneath that chaos, Grant found himself grateful for once that his years fixing these vehicles had taught him exactly which wires controlled which system. Silas slumped against the support beam Grant had pinned him to, no longer fighting, watching the scene unfold with the flat, resigned stare of a man who understood the story was no longer his to control. Nolan lunged toward the laptop to destroy the uplink before the transfer finished, and Mallory threw herself in his path only to be forced to the ground under his weight. Grant met him using whatever tools the maintenance bay offered, unable to overpower him through strength alone, but using the layout of the space, a length of pull cable, and a hydraulic bench to trap Nolan's leg and finally bring him down. Inside the hospital, Tessa reached the control room and activated the building's public address system, publicly confessing that she had signed falsified medical records under direct threats from Silas Crowe. Her confession reached hospital staff, bystanders outside, and the state police units that had just begun arriving at the perimeter. At that same moment, the data finished uploading, and the recorded footage of Silas confessing to Helen's death transmitted simultaneously to state investigators, a federal prosecutor's office, and several independent news outlets. Nolan tried firing one final shot, but his weapon had run dry, and Grant restrained him without taking his life, refusing to let this night end the way Silas had ended so many others. Silas watched a line of state police vehicles pour into the lot and understood for the first time in his career that there was no one left willing to take his orders. Mallory formally read him his rights, while Grant stood a short distance away, feeling no triumph, only a quiet stillness, as he watched a man he had once called family placed in handcuffs. Justice had finally arrived, but it could never return the 16 years Silas had stolen from him. In the months that followed, the investigation widened across several counties, and Silas Crowe, Nolan Briggs, and Wade Sutter faced a long list of charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, drug trafficking, obstruction of justice, and public corruption. Mallory's former commanding officer was arrested as well, exposed as the source who had leaked her operation from the very beginning. Tessa became a critical witness, and while she accepted responsibility for the records she had signed, her testimony helped identify every victim connected to the scheme and restored the reputations of people who had been wrongly blamed for years. Helen's death was formally reopened, the original report signed by Silas thrown out entirely, and the case reclassified as a deliberate homicide rather than an accident. Grant didn't attend every hearing that followed, choosing instead to appear only on the day Helen's name was formally cleared, and she was recognized as the first person who had tried to expose the truth. News of what had happened in Bellwether traveled well beyond the county line, and for weeks, Grant found himself fielding questions from reporters and investigators alike, most of whom wanted to know what it felt like to discover a man he trusted for 16 years had ordered his wife's death. Grant never gave them the answer they were looking for, because there wasn't a single word that could hold something that large, and instead, he simply told each of them the same thing: that trust wasn't the mistake, believing silence was safer than the truth had been. Bellwether itself changed slowly in the months that followed. A new sheriff appointed from outside the county, the hospital placed under independent oversight, and a quiet reckoning working its way through every office that had once answered to Silas Crowe, without question. The workshop had been badly damaged during the chase that night, and though the people of Bellwether offered to raise money to rebuild it, Grant accepted only donated materials and refused every cash contribution offered to him. He hung a small sign above the entrance that read Helen Holloway Repair and Rescue, a quiet tribute no one asked him to explain. Mallory recovered from her injuries and was offered a promotion within her department, but she requested time away first to think honestly about the direction of her own life. On a mild, rainy afternoon months later, she returned to the shop, dressed in ordinary clothes, without a badge or a borrowed uniform, carrying only a folded cloth she said she wanted to return. Her car hadn't broken down, and the vehicle didn't need any repair at all, since she had only come to give back the rag Grant once used to bandage her shoulder on the night they first met. She had washed it carefully and folded it into a small square, an oddly gentle gesture for an object that had once been soaked through with her own blood. And she admitted on the drive over she had rehearsed at least a dozen different reasons for showing up before finally deciding the truth was simpler than any excuse she could invent. Grant teased her that the cloth wasn't worth driving hundreds of miles to return, and Mallory admitted it had only ever been an excuse to see him again. She apologized for choosing his workshop as a hiding place without ever giving him a real choice in the matter. And Grant told her she had guessed correctly about one thing: that he would never leave someone bleeding out in the rain. When she asked whether he regretted opening that door, Grant looked toward the sign bearing Helen's name and answered that his only regret was spending so many years believing Silas Crowe's kindness had ever been real. He said he would never regret becoming the kind of man Helen always believed he could be, and then he simply invited Mallory inside for coffee. She stepped through the door, and just before it closed behind them, Grant glanced once more down the empty road where he had first found her collapsed in the storm. That night he believed he had only rescued a stranger claiming to be a nurse in trouble. In truth, Mallory had given him the chance to recover the truth, restore his late wife's honor, and reclaim the years that Silas Crow had quietly stolen from his life. The rain finally stopped outside, sunlight breaking through the clouds, and catching on the new sign above the workshop door. Grant couldn't undo the past, but for the first time in 16 years, he was no longer living in its shadow. He had learned the hardest way a person can learn anything, that kindness offered to a stranger in the rain is never really wasted, and that the quiet decision to open a door can on the right night change the entire shape of a life, and sometimes the truth someone else has been carrying alone.